Hello everyone and welcome to Nancy's Magic Touch and DIYs. In today's video, I am going to share with you how to create a beautiful welcome sign for your home. I'm going to share step by step what I did, and I am going to put all the product I use in the description box down below. So without any further ado guys, just grab your tea and let's get started. I'm using Minwax stain for this project and it's in the color black. And I'm using a pine board that is 12 inches wide by 4 feet high. I'm applying this stain, go in with the wood grain on both sides of my plank along with the side edges. Once you're done, apply the stain throughout all your board. You're just going to let it dry for a few hours. I used my Cricut machine to create my design. I created my design the same width as my pine board. And now I am going to weed off the excess of vinyl that I'm not going to be using. I am going to tape this down as it's going to make it easier for me to work as it tends to roll. Now I'm going to use my Cricut tool and remove the letters to create my stencil. Now I'm going to use some transfer paper to transfer my stencil to my board. So I'm going to cut that transfer paper to size to match my stencil. I'm removing the back paper from my transfer paper, and when I put it on my design, I want to make sure that I follow the guidelines. That helps you create a really straight line and also helps you measure the inches. Each square is 1 inch, so that really helps you to put your creation right in the middle. So I really suggest trying to use those red lines as a guideline. When you want to take it off, I also suggest that you turn your paper upside down. It makes it much easier to remove the transfer paper than if you were to try from the top. Now I'm going to carefully apply my stencil to my board following those red guidelines. This really helps me to make sure I put the signs in the middle. Once you applied, you want to apply pressure to your stencil just to make it stick to your board, and try to remove all bubbles that is remaining. I like to also measure to make sure that I have the right amount on each side. And I'm also going to measure from the top. Now I'm slowly going to remove the transfer paper. It is important to take your time when you do this step to make sure everything sticks properly to the board. Now this transfer paper is reusable. So the backing that you took off originally, you can put it back onto your transfer paper, but make sure you put the shiny side of the paper to the transfer paper, to the sticky part of the transfer paper, and just put it back on, and then you can reuse that for later projects. And now you're going to repeat the steps from the first stencil that we just did. It's the exact same thing and the exact same way. I applied my second stencil to my board, and I applied it a few inches down from the top one. And now I'm rubbing off all the bubbles that are in my vinyl. The reason for that is that if there's bubble remaining, that could create bleeding from your paint, and you don't want that. So take your time and remove all the bubble from your stencil. Now I'm repeating the same step for my third piece, my third stencil that needs to go on my board. Sometimes in the process, it's possible that you lift it by mistake and then it creates a bubble. No worries, just take your tool, lift it, and then slowly put it back down. And there you go. And sometimes too, you can actually rip your vinyl. Not to worry, just lift it and put it back in place. And once you put your transfer paper on that, it will grab that no problem, and you won't even see it. It is also awkward sometimes to work with long pieces of vinyl. They're sticky and they're awkward. So what I recommend, just take your scissors and cut it off. That makes it so much easier to work with, and then just start where you left off. When you work with a bigger piece of a stencil, I recommend when you use your transfer paper to take the backing out, but put it back on a few inches from the top. Just leave yourself a few inches to work with, the sticky part, and then follow the red lines and just pull the backing of the transfer paper out as you go along. And that makes the job so much easier. Otherwise, it's awkward, it sticks everywhere, you got to pull it up and then try again. This way you do it once and it's nice and smooth, and there's no issue, there's no struggles. So I really highly recommend that you do it this way when you work with a bigger piece of stencil and vinyl. Again, I recommend flipping it upside down and removing the back of the vinyl rather than moving the transfer paper. It's so much easier. Now, before I applied my third piece of vinyl, I am going to measure the distance between my first and second letter to make sure that I allow for the same distance for my third vinyl. So I want to have the same distance between my paw print and my M letter that I do have from the H and the paw print. Once you're happy with your measurements, you just go ahead and apply your piece. Just rub it on and just apply pressure to make sure that your vinyl sticks to your board. I'm using Polycrylic by Minwax, and I'm applying that on my board with a paintbrush. The reason why I'm using Minwax is because it's kind of act as a barrier. What I mean by that is sometimes when you create stencils and you have bubbles remaining when you paint on your stencils, the paint goes through inside those little bubbles, and that's what we call bleeding. So by applying the polycrylic, it's creating kind of a barrier. It's kind of sealing those bubbles. So that way, when you go to apply your paint on top of the polycrylic, it's already sealed and the paint can't bleed through. I always use this when I do a stain stencil, and the reason for that is because if your paint is bleeding, you haven't used polycrylic and your paint is bleeding, it's very hard to remove paint from a stain board, and it doesn't make it very nice and clean. So that way, by creating a barrier with the polycrylic, then you don't have to worry about that. Your piece will turn out nice and crisp every time. If you painted your piece, if your board was painted, you don't really have to worry about this part, because if there is a little bit of bleed, you could always go touch it up with a little paintbrush, the color that it needs to be, and that's not that big of a deal. But where it's a stain piece, you want this piece, the stain board, to be nice and clean looking. So the polycrylic is really playing a big role when you are working with a stain sign. When I apply, I make sure that I go very carefully around the edges, because that's the important part to be sealed, because that's where the bubbles will be and that's where the paint can get through. So I make sure that I'm applying a good, I apply it properly around the edges of my stencil. When I'm going to do my letters on the top, they are much smaller. So I'm going to switch to a smaller brush just to make my life a little bit easier and to be a little bit more gentle around the smaller area. Once I'm done applying the polycrylic, I am going to let this dry for a bit. Polycrylic dries very quickly. So in about 20 minutes, half hour, you should be good to go to start applying your paint. Now that my piece is dry, it's time to paint the piece. I'm using a craft paint from the dollar store in white. And what I'm using to do this step is actually a sponge brush. I'm going to apply little bits at a time. I'm going to wipe it off my brush a little bit, and I'm not going to do strokes. I'm just going to do some dabbing. I'm just going to dab it on And that makes it less chance for paint to run. Again, that's another kind of safe thing to do. So I'm gonna dab that all through my sign, and I don't put a lot of paint on my sponge at a time. I'm just going a little bit by little bit, so baby steps. It makes it for a much nicer, crisp look. Now that the first coat is dry, we're going to go ahead and apply the same coat the exact same way. In my case, I applied 3 coats. I found that the brown was still shining through a little bit on the second coat, so I did this step 3 times, and I allowed for it to dry between each application. This is what my second coat looked like. So as you can see, I can still see a little bit of the brown and it's bothering me. So I'm applying the third coat. The paint is dried and I removed the stencil. Now I'm going to apply Polycrylic by Minwax again all over my board. I'm applying the coat of Polycrylics going with the wood grain. Now before I move on to applying this on the other side, I'm going to let this side dry. Now that the polycrylic is all applied, we're just waiting for it to dry. Once it's dried, I put a little heart on the paw print. I applied that with hot glue, and I decorated my piece with some rope on top and bottom. And this is the final results. Well, folks, that's it. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, feel free to subscribe to my channel, give me the thumbs up, or leave me comments down below. Until next time, folks, thank you so much and have a great day.